The only other object of note in Erskine's room was a picture hanging on the wall from a nail. A circle, obviously described by a compass, and broken at its lowest point, occupied the middle foreground of this picture. Was it receding? What had that impression? In the eastern background appeared a point or dot. The circumference was black. The point was blue. But blue! The rest was white. How the effect of perspective was obtained, Watt did not know. But it was obtained. By what means the illusion of movement in space, and it almost seems in time, was given, Watt could not say. But it was given. Watt wondered how long it would be before the point and the circle entered together upon the same plane. Or had they not done so already, or almost? Or was it not rather the circle that was in the background and the point that was in the foreground? Watt wondered if they had sighted each other, or were blindly flying thus, harried by some force of merely mechanical mutual attraction, or the playthings of chance. He wondered if they would eventually pause and converse, and perhaps even mingle, or keep steadfast on their ways like ships in the night, prior to the invention of wireless telegraphy. Who knows, they might even collide. And he wondered what the artist had intended to represent. Watt knew nothing about painting. A circle and its centre in search of each other, or a circle and its centre in search of a centre and a circle, respectively, or a circle and its centre in search of its centre and a circle, respectively, or a circle and its centre in search of a centre and its circle, respectively, or a circle and a centre not its centre in search of its centre and its circle, respectively, or a circle and a centre not its centre in search of a centre and a circle, respectively, or a circle and a centre not its centre in search of its centre and a circle, respectively, or a circle and a centre not its centre in search of a centre and its circle, respectively, in boundless space, in endless time. Watt knew nothing about physics. And at the thought that it was perhaps this, a circle and a centre not its centre, in search of a centre and its circle, respectively, in boundless space, in endless time, then Watt's eyes filled with tears that he could not stem, and they flowed down his fluted cheeks, unchecked, in a steady flow, refreshing him greatly.
Hi, this is Nick, and welcome to another episode of the Books of Some Substance podcast, where today we're talking about Samuel Beckett's Watt. And joining me today is Catherine Flynn, English professor at the University of California-Berkeley. Catherine, welcome.
Hi, Nick. Hi, happy to be here.
So we're talking about Beckett's Watt, maybe a sort of a underrepresented book in Beckett's canon, if you will. And so to start, for something that is so exact and so specific, it's also impressively vague. So maybe the best question is a vague question to start, which is, what the hell is this book?
What is this? Exactly. I mean, it is exactly that, specific and vague at the same time. And to put it simply, I think it's Beckett experimenting with language that has no meaning. So to show that it has no meaning, he has to use it really precisely in these extremely repetitive ways. So he's always driving at a meaning, but always showing that no meaning really emerges. And the closer you get to one, or the minute you think you've grasped it, actually turns out to be the opposite case, or maybe something else. There's a constant process of deferral. So this makes the book seem extremely strange. There's so many lists of permutations of phrases and possibilities and actions, and that the reader kind of feels like they ask that question, what is this? And I think that's what they're meant to ask. In a way, this is a book about the collapse of metaphysics. Metaphysics is the philosophy of being. What are we? What is it to be? What is an individual? What is a substance? What causes things? And this is an ancient tradition of philosophy that runs aground, definitely by the 20th century. And so Beckett is using the terms of metaphysics and the kind of structures of thought to show that metaphysics doesn't work anymore, or to explore how it doesn't work anymore. So what is really what? What is it to be? What is being? But it's a kind of a rude version, a crude version. Yeah.
Right. And as you were reading the intro quote, I actually had to kind of cover my mouth to stop from laughing, because I have to tell a story is that we're reading this in the local reading group, and everyone kind of hates this
Yeah.
book.
Oh,
It
yeah.
was the lowest attendance of any
Yeah.
discussion that we had. But
yeah.
then we sat around, we started reading it out loud, and we were
Yeah.
all just cracking up.
Yeah.
And you realize that those permutations are so absurd when you really force yourself to read all of them.
Yeah.
That
Yeah.
it's actually just such a supreme level of comedy at the same time while breaking down all of those other things.
Absolutely. I mean, this is Beckett's genius, that he will show us the kind of the suffering we experience when we search for meaning, or just when we live, and then by showing it to us, make us laugh. I don't know, there's something about like the awareness of our shared predicament that is a huge relief, and it just leads to laughter.
Right.
So this is a hard book. I mean, it's a hard book because it doesn't have, I don't know, the trilogy has a lot of drama and status. And so people kind of know what they're getting into. But what starts more like a normal novel, like you think things are going to happen. You think there's going to be a plot of some kind. But then, almost on the first page, the second page, you're already thinking, this is just weird. So it's in some ways unrewarding, if you approach it as a traditional novel. But it's once you get into these crazy kind of guitar riffs of permutations that then it starts to be fun. I mean, people avoid teaching it often because it's such a tough read for students. They teach Murphy, for example, or they go hardcore with the trilogy, but they just don't bother with Watt.
Yeah, that's actually perfect. It's an exercise in guitar riffs that don't have any sort of scale associated with them whatsoever.
Yeah.
It's completely free form by hitting all of the notes in every single possible order in all. Basically, that's an argument for Iron Maiden in a way. But it's fascinating to think of the kind of almost like the machine-like, especially now today in the modern era, whatever that may be, where everything is so algorithm-driven, and we're sort of almost at the mercy of these types of decisions going on in the background of our day-to-day life. To actually see it written down and somebody forcing themselves to go through all of these, the passage I think that was the most difficult of anything was the descriptions of how all of the furniture might be in the room. I think that might have been the longest one and arguably the least interesting and even least funny. But just the fact that was written out, like every single step and every single ordering, it becomes its own thing.
It really does.
And you just, there's the question of like, what if you were to really write down everything that you imagined your brain was really going through and every single decision process you would make? And maybe that's actually realism. Yeah.
No, I think that's a great point. It's about like a world without higher values. So like normally people will, conclude or find a solution through reference to some external truth of some kind. This is how you kind of draw a conclusion. But if there are no external truths to draw on, all you have are just iterations. Like all you have are just, you can just reorganize the furniture over and over again, or, put your shoes on in a different order, a boot and a shoe, or then two boots, or, et cetera, et cetera. No need to get into it.
Beckett's very obsessed with boots, I think.
He really...
Between this and Godot. But...
Yeah. Oh, yeah. And in the trilogy as well, there's a lot of shoe talk.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But then he also, the thing that I find fascinating is, so I have my tabs in my book that are all over the place.
Too. I've got more tabs.
And I realized I started out trying to put down what I thought were kind of the smart ones, the observations, the aphorisms and stuff.
Yeah.
And then I kind of transitioned into marking the things that just made me laugh.
Yeah.
But some of the points that were so impressive were when he would come out of some of these repetitions and then say something that was actually very simple and very insightful. And so one of my favorites of these is... to think, when one is no longer young, when one is not yet old, that one is no longer young, that one is not yet old, that is perhaps something.
Yeah, exactly.
You could print that in a book, and that would be a good book by itself.
Totally, and it is perhaps something. Like that's definitely inarguable.
Right, yeah, it's 100% factual, just like the rest of his lists.
Make a fridge magnet of that. Yeah, it's true. I mean, there's another passage where... there's a description of Watt's use of language, like that he there's a few pages of him working out something or working through something, and then a description of it as Watt made a pillow for his head, and I think an old pillow of words, or a pillow of old words for his head, and that's sort of what language is when you don't have these sort of higher, metaphysical truths like God, etc., to infuse some kind of depth or, some kind of value into what you're saying. You're just sort of soothing your mind with language. And that's language at its best in a way, because at certain moments in Beckett, we're trapped in the toils of language. And that definitely features in Watt as well.
Right.
We're forced to think.
And so Beckett, kind of classically, as people try to interpret his works, often would sort of recede into there is no interpretation, or everything that's contained is on the page. Sort of famously when he would be asked about some of his plays and the productions, people would ask him for extra details, and he would say, well, if I would have known, I would have written it down. And so, the way that the addenda of Watt wraps up is the brief fragment, no symbols where none intended.
Yeah.
But then I also like to ask myself, well, is this really just completely literal, or is there something lurking beneath this? And maybe that intro quote that you read that seems to actually have a lot of stuff and is very emotionally moving too, as Watt sort of maybe displays his only large emotion throughout the book. Yeah. So what are your thoughts on what might be behind that?
I mean, I think Beckett doesn't he doesn't like the idea of symbols, because symbols imply some kind of higher order of meaning, instead of we're just going to rearrange the furniture. And so he's very resentful of that kind of use of language. Like, you probably know the letter to Axel Kahn that he wrote in 1937, where he talks about destroying language and bringing language into disrepute. And he thinks that grammar and style are as outmoded as Victorian bathing suit and the gentleman's imperturbability. And that he wants to tear apart the veil of language to get at whatever or the nothingness that's behind it. And so this sense that language is a kind of performance that we've bought into all along, that we have to realize is merely a performance, that is really motivating this. And this novel to a large extent. It's not that there is no meaning or there are no references in Beckett's works. He might want us to think that or say that. It's a typical kind of artist's pose in a way. But there certainly are. Beckett really presented himself as, in many ways, the anti-Joyce. Like, Joyce did everything with language. Ulysses and Finnegans Wake are these epic achievements, whereas Beckett is interested in failure, and Beckett is interested in nothingness, and a kind of minimalism, where Joyce is a maximalist, and definitely Finnegans Wake. And so that's true to a certain extent, but it's actually not fully true. So some of the stranger passages in Watt can actually be, well, not explained, but can be illuminated to some extent by reference to the philosophical context that Beckett is working off. So Beckett is really working against this tradition of metaphysics that, was especially related to theology. So scholasticism took ideas from Aristotle and Plato and wedded them with Christian theology. It was a kind of hybrid form. So it was attempting to explain faith through reason. So, reveal doctrine, reveal truth was given explication through rational means. And so scholastics were very interested in working through all of the connotations of a proposition. And Descartes, who Beckett is also extremely interested in, took up or kind of redeveloped that scholastic method. This is apparently definitely what Schopenhauer thinks of Descartes. Descartes makes this big gesture of break. Aha!
I have my Schopenhauer.
Yeah, wow. So Descartes makes this huge gesture of a rupture with the philosophical past and wants to start again. But actually, the thoroughness of the Cartesian approach, the Cartesian method, is really borrowed from scholasticism. So it's about identifying the difficulty, break it into its parts, starting with the simplest, going to the most complex, and enumerating every possible possibility. Every possibility. And so this is, in lots of ways, what Beckett is doing in these crazy long lists of permutations, except that there is no revealed truth to back up or give a conclusion. He's cycling through these structures of thinking in a futile way. But it's not totally futile. Like in that passage, when he gets to the end, he feels this sense of futility and he weeps. Right. What weeps? But the tears themselves are actually really refreshing, and on he goes. So there's no kind of dramatic conclusion to this. There's no end, It's really about just sort of pausing and feeling a sense of despair and then going on and, on to the next thing. But the circle and the point and the center are also from this tradition. So there's the statement that God is a circle without a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. And this is, it was repeated by many people. They think Nicholas of Cusa definitely said it, and people before him maybe said it. And this idea of a circle and its center is repeated in this passage in Watt. But the circle is now outside its circumference. And Watt longs for the center to find the circle. He has this whole kind of little narrative. It's like a romance story of maybe they'll meet, or maybe they'll pass like ships in the night. But this is all about the kind of remnants of theology and the remnants of a universe understood as utterly filled with God's presence. And now God is gone and the universe is left, and it's sort of signified by this circle and this center. Of course, we said this to Beckett, he'd say, no, it's just a circle and a point. Like, that's all it is. And that is all it is, in fact. It's just a painting. So it's just representation now. It's just lines on a canvas, like words on a page. So I think that there are ways, to come back to your question, there are definitely ways of interpreting Beckett. It does really help to know about the contexts that he's attacking, especially Descartes. He gets so much mileage out of Descartes' the steps in reasoning that Descartes makes that maybe aren't 100% justified. And he just goes to town on those. I mean, the trilogy in lots of ways, but even parts of this are all about exploiting those problems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the use of language within Beckett's own trajectory is kind of fascinating to try to piece together, which is, so Watt being written during the World War II, in exile in rural France, but not released until after sort of the trilogy and Godot were sort of hitting.
Yeah.
And even to then, it was kind of released to, it was on an imprint of, I believe, Olympia Books, which is sort of the Henry Miller and also half pornography kind of Parisian English-speaking press, right? And so this kind of came out to people, and it was almost an afterthought.
Yeah.
But Beckett's shift into French, or writing in French, is not as clean as people want it to be. There's sort of this story of him sort of having this big epiphany, and then he goes back and he writes these momentous works in French. But it's kind of a little bit messy in there. And so I kind of want to look at this as a potential link from the earlier sort of explorations of Murphy and Beckett's youthful writings, as this a potential connection into the trilogy, which really strips a lot of this down. It removes the idea of an external narrator. It goes fully into the interior, because if you're going to get to the heart of what anything truly is, you have to remove any of those inconsistencies that might come from an exterior narrator and its knowingness and all that. So I feel like Watt, if you think about it in that context, is really a bridge into that, because even though it has the external narrator of, I suppose, Beckett himself, he kind of refers to Sam.
Sam.
He kind of shows his
bit
hand
confusing.
there.
Hi, Sam. You don't know who it is.
Just back-to-back sentences, switches between, But this is the narrator trying to get, I think, at that core, at that definition, earlier than when he jumps into the trilogy and when he really starts to drill it down. So I guess kind of curious, do you see that in the same way? Like, what are the signals of this book in that style that kind of provide a trajectory into the trilogy?
Yeah. I mean, I think that it is to do with this foregrounding of the process of thinking, and that it's not the content of thought or its conclusions, but the way to watch a mind working. That's what we start to see in Watt. So in Murphy, he just wants to silence his mind. He wants to escape. He wants stasis and calm and some kind of, sort of deathly experience in life. In Watt, we get the full blast of, what it is to just be involved in cogitation as a process, just as a linguistic process. And this is quite similar in some ways to the trilogy, where, as you say, we're inside a mind now. We hear someone's thoughts. It's a more intimate space, but it still is thinking as kind of patterns of language, and thinking that is flawed, fallible, and it is increasingly discontinuous. So if Watt has, in some ways, kind of predictable habits, and he's actually a fairly continuous presence in the book. You can really count on Watt to be, physically awkward and to have these sort of strangely literal responses to things. In the trilogy, we start to see increasingly discontinuous narrators, first-person narrators. And this is really pushing further into the problem of being a person. And this is where, his kind of attack on or use of Descartes becomes really relevant, where Descartes asks, what can we know? Is there anything we can know for sure? And what he hits on is his famous cogito, I think, therefore I am. And it's this awareness of consciousness that is really secure. And this is inarguable. We feel ourselves, in our minds, in my very sophisticated reformulation. But to put it into words, I think, therefore I am, makes a step into language, which is not something that originates with us. So thinking, awareness is one thing, but thinking is another. And so thinking comes to us from the outside. Language is given to us. It runs through us. And that's how we experience ourselves as selves. So the self is a performance. It's a narrative. It's a monologue. But one that, as Beckett shows in the trilogy, can be disrupted, is discontinuous, is really problematic. We want it to stop, but it won't stop. Or there's nothing to do but continue it. And so this is the kind of doubling down of Beckett into the trilogy from a book like What?
Mm-hmm. And there was, so I want to read a quote from Beckett's Three Dialogues, sort of an essay, or rather sort of pseudo-dialogue on someone in the art scene in Paris at the time. And so, but he has this quote that kind of reveals sort of what some of his own thinking is. He's kind of mapping it to someone else's art, but it fits very nicely into this. And so he says, "The expression that there is nothing to express, nothing with which to express, nothing from which to express, no power to express, no desire to express, together with the obligation to express."
Yeah.
And I think that last chunk, the obligation to express,
yeah,
almost sums up Watt as sort of like step one. And then the trilogy, even following through to Krapp's Last Tape and an Endgame, you get that obligation of I have to, the famous quote, I'll continue on, right?
Yeah.
But
I can't go on.
I can't go on. I'll go on.
Yeah.
But just that sort of tension that comes in this, that there is nothing left to say, yet you still have to say it.
Yeah. And that all you can do is speak, actually, that we're creatures who have language imposed on us, and we can't get rid of it. Language is going to be working within us. There is the other idea that we're trying to use language to get to something, but we can't. There's nothing to get to, as that quotation says so beautifully, with its amazing repetitions.
And so we focused a lot on language, but I kind of want to go back into sort of some of the mathematical underpinnings of this. Cool. And there is, not
the engineer now,
not from a technical standpoint, but rather just from a humor standpoint. But the whole section, the story of Bando.
Oh yeah.
Which I believe is this his reference to some sort of drug?
I don't know if that
seems illicit in
historically
a way.
Existed.
Yeah. Yeah. So I was trying to figure out, what was the actual meaning behind that. But I'll start. I'll read where they introduce Bando, which is supposed to be a sort of a fix for how the gardener, Mr. Graves, is feeling. So. "Have you tried Bando, Mr. Graves?" said Arthur. "A capsule, before and after meals, in a little warm milk, and again at night, before turning in. I had tried everything, and was thoroughly disgusted, when a friend spoke to me of Bando. Her husband was never without it, you understand. 'Try it,' she said, 'and come back in 5 or 6 years.' I tried it, Mr. Graves, and it changed my whole outlook on life, from being a moody, listless, constipated man, covered with squams, shunned by my fellows, my breath fetid and my appetite depraved. For years I had eaten nothing but high-fat rashers. I became, after 4 years of bandos, vivacious, restless, a popular nudist, regular in my daily health, almost a father, and a lover of boiled potatoes. Bando, spelt as pronounced. And that sort of being the almost like the header to this super weird story about somebody else he knew who tried bando, who then went on this basically academic research trip to find a peasant who is perfect at cube roots. And then he brought him back to an entire panel of, I believe, academics of some sort in order to show this off. Yet there's intense permutations of them looking at each other and the different ways that they would look to each other, and how much time that wasted. And if only they had a plan for everybody to look at each other in sort of an n-1 manner, such that finally you would get to 0 and then you could move on. And it just, there's so much of an underpinning of that concept of permutations, but here it's just quite literal. It's even more literal because he's talking about a mathematical thing in cube roots, and there's even a very small little verbal joke to it too. Let me see if I can find it. So for the concept of cube roots, he goes ahead and says, "You can stand by the extirpation of the root," said Mr. Fitzvine. And if you look up extirpation, which I did because I didn't know what it was, it basically means to root out and destroy.
Yeah.
So he's taking this extra level of his math on top of his language, on top of his puns, and linking it all together in this sort of absurd academic story that I think is based on a weird version of whatever upper he imagined in terms of a drug called bando.
Yeah.
And I just find that to be such a combination of things that, from a personal standpoint, I just love when reading. I mean, it's so hard to just not be smiling during these sections of, you referenced Joyce as a maximalist, but it's almost overdoing minimalism in such a literal fashion. It's not maximally flowery, or the language is not the maximum element. It's the total sum of it.
It is, exactly, the accumulation. And the accumulation of small parts. And I think there's just something so wonderful. It's funny because it's ridiculous, it's absurd. But I think it's also funny because it's kind of heartening that like little things, just small things added up in all of their minor deviations, you can count on them, they're there. And that if bando is introduced right after the encounter with or the problems of talking about not, the problems, what has all of his inversions, his backwards behavior, which we could talk about, this sort of failed encounter.
Actually walking backwards?
Yeah, and speaking backwards, but in so many different ways. Yeah. And the bando then is introduced as the kind of commercial answer to this. Forget about your kind of theological urges, your curiosity about not. Instead, take bando, spelt as written.
It's actually like the plot of the Kids in the Hall movie Brain Candy, if you're familiar.
Oh, yeah?
Just to ultimately fix all of your problems.
Yeah, but it turns out that actually bando gets mired as well in all of these like little details and these sort of just lived experience in the world in this really mundane way. And I find that so, it's like the kind of triumph of the tiny, or like the triumph of the mundane and the humble, I mean, it's hard to find exactly the right word for it because everything is so precise and it is so varied. Yeah, but there are no inventions, there are no great ideas that save the day. Things continue in their kind of painful but funny way. And that's maybe all. That's to say that's all we need is a kind of trite conclusion, like the end of the book, where the guy's like, it's not such a bad world. Which obviously it is a bad word. Yeah.
So the other way I was trying to kind of slice this book was in sort of relationship with kind of second half of 20th century sort of the dreaded postmodern term. I associated a lot with kind of American authors like Barthelme and Barth and guys like that really took some of the tricks that are in here and really cranked that knob on it.
Yeah.
And I was trying to figure out, because having read almost entirely or almost a whole biography on Beckett, there's really barely anything on Watt. I think it's kind of an afterthought in a lot of different ways.
Yeah.
But I see some of these moves being things that really, to me, seem to anticipate some of the things that people would do as they push some of the boundaries of what those fictional forms look like. Yeah. And you see things, it's not a lot of footnotes, but he has them, and they're very humorous. Yeah. And he sticks those in as a nice little aside. I think at one point he talks about hemophilia as something that affects only women, except in this book where it affects men.
Yeah. Yeah.
But then he also, there's kind of the layered concept of the sort of the quotes within a quote within a quote, where you have the narrator sort of referencing Watt, who sort of referenced someone else, and sort of the rhythms of that sort of anticipate. We did a podcast a little while back on Laszlo Krasznahorkai. There's a John Barth story that in Lost in the Funhouse that has sort of these descending layers of quotes, and he actually uses actual quotes, quotation marks, to show how many. At some point they're like 7 or 8 deep, because somebody within a story is telling a story within a story. Yeah. And so I find it kind of fascinating that this is something that I don't think Beckett really wanted to be his legacy at all, right? Certainly the Siege in the Room works of the trilogy and Godot were the things that I think he felt were most representative. Yeah. But there's still a whole section of people that seem, in my opinion, I don't have A to B line for this, but seem to be referencing this. This is kind of a proto-text in a lot of ways. Yeah. So I'm kind of curious, like, do you see that in the same way as these tricks showing up later in fiction?
I mean, I also don't have an A to B line on it. I don't know. I mean, maybe someone has written about this. I should know. But
we should have Googled it.
I think that I don't know if what is actually, as you say, what is an underread book or under-talked about book. And he does all kinds of super interesting things here that I think you're totally right, do anticipate postmodern techniques. But in some ways are kind of... I don't know, I want to kind of say more fun, but I don't mean that in a bad way, because I really enjoy John Barth, for example. But like at the beginning, when the narrator messes up, like there's these 2 characters at the bus stop. There are multiple characters at the bus stop, but there's a couple called Teddy and Goff. And the narrator changes how he refers to them once someone says their surname. So he realizes, it's like the narrator realizes that he's been wrong. And the narrator is watching events play out without any control over them. It's a really interesting moment, I think. And this is again about undermining the authority of language. So in some ways, something like Lost in the Funhouse is about literature is all-encompassing. It becomes this world that you can't escape. It involves everything. It's a sort of power move, this kind of grab where nothing is left that's, authentic, inverted commas. I mean, obviously a very kind of problematic Bogues term, but, nothing is untouched. Nothing is outside of the sphere of the literary. But Beckett uses it in some ways to, I don't know if it's the opposite effect, but it's a very different effect, to say that the literary is enfeebled because it's language, and language is a very frail instrument. And that anyone putting words on a page is actually, just kind of putting words on a page. I mean, Beckett himself described this book in less than glowing terms. He said it was merely an exercise and that it was unsatisfactory. But I feel that by his own standards, that's exactly what he wanted it to be. That if it was successful, it would be wrong. I mean, this would be... So he's really trying to undermine language and awaken us to... the kind of fact of language as, it's something, it's all around us, it's in us, but we can't trust it necessarily at all. It's a kind of means to an end, maybe, but you can get caught in it, in the sort of, the ideals, the sentiments, the supposed truths that it presents us with. Mm-hmm. So I feel like, I don't know, that it's a very sort of philosophically serious and still really funny way of writing a novel. Like, there are also examples where he says, and this is the song that he sang, and then there'll be a question mark, and there's no song. So
right, yes, the question mark.
Yeah.
Because for a second I was like, did we lose this part in the war? Did that not come through?
No, the narrator failed in some way. He's like, don't know, didn't understand.
And the narrator, when they break in, when he has this huge paragraph of things separated by semicolons, and he just writes a sentence about how much he hates the semicolon, but then continues just using semicolons.
Yeah. I mean, it's like, these are kind of moments of intimacy, I think, with the reader, and they're always really surprising in Beckett. Like, there's such a kind of, exploration of suffering and futility. But amidst that is this amazing camaraderie. Like, there's this moment where Watt collapses in the ditch, and he, it's pretty sordid, he vomits in there, and it's all really horrible. But there's a sentence like, the parts of the body really do seem very friendly towards one another in such a situation. And it's like this, and it's kind of true, like you might have collapsed into a ditch, but somehow it feels kind of good to be lying on the ground. It's so like skillfully put. It's so like those quotations you read earlier, so understated that it has to make you laugh. Like it maybe is something, yeah.
And the ditch thing to me seems like a precursor to the character, I forget in which book of the trilogy, because I read them right in a row.
Yeah.
But when it's raining, he decides to lay down on the ground such that only one half of him gets wet. But then it continues to rain so much that he realizes he should have gotten up, but now he can't get up because he's made this decision to protect one half of him.
Yeah.
So I see lots of little of those nuggets that kind of early versions of Watt as like the quintessential Beckett man.
Yeah.
The older the deterioration is on set and all of that stuff is starting to happen, but it hasn't really reached that sort of primal kind of rawness yet.
Yeah.
It's still got a little bit of a sheen.
Yeah.
And then, Beckett's comments about, trying to write in a different language such that he would no longer fall victim to sort of almost his own cleverness or the way his familiarity with English lended it to that aspect.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you look at something like More Pricks Than Kicks, Beckett is super skilled and he knows a huge amount and it's very erudite and very witty. But it's a kind of Joycean path. And so what he's very much what he turns towards is poverty and a kind of linguistic poverty, even though it's peppered with abstruse terms, actually. But I mean, in some ways, the poverty is felt all the more because of that. And he's really interested, too, in destitute figures. Like they are suffering, broken people. And there's an attention to that, an abiding with that's truly moving.
And you made a Schopenhauer reference earlier, but we all know that Beckett read a bunch of him in the early days, and one would say a lot of the sentiment never really left.
Yeah.
And of course, the main Schopenhauer quote that people know is the popular one of, "A quick test of the assertion that enjoyment outweighs pain in this world, or that they are in any rate balanced, would be to compare the feelings of an animal engaged in eating another with those of an animal being eaten."
I didn't know that quote.
Okay, that's I feel like that's the perfect sentiment for Beckett's never describing anything of his own positive, because he simply tacks in that direction. Yeah. But then also with respect to sort of deterioration in time. So this is all from the essay.
Yeah. And it really connects to with Beckett's refusal to glorify nature.
Right. Absolutely.
Like that scene where they're out enjoying the natural world, but it ends up they're feeding the animals, but then it ends up they're feeding rats to their mothers and fathers and brothers and sisters and other more distantly related rats who were less fortunate to be less distantly related. So that means that it's more enjoyable for the rat families to eat one another than stranger rats to eat one. It's like a crazy world of, familial aggression. So nature and the family, these two kind of bulwarks of, 19th century literature or kind of traditional thought, or I don't know when, but they really come under attack in Beckett.
Of course, he also has that section in Watt where he describes all the physical ailments of that poor family, where every single person, where they're trying to get to living to be, is it 1,000 years?
Oh, yeah.
They're trying to get their ages to total up, but all their ailments start to stack down. And every single example is very terrible.
Yeah.
They're all shackled with some sort of physical affliction.
Yeah. I mean, basically, they're shackled with life, you know?
Right.
Like, life is an affliction for Beckett. And there's that, you know, hilarious section in Arsons Monologue, one of the first big monologues in What?
Mm-hmm.
Where he talks about life as an excrescence, a turd. It's extremely funny how much he resents this imposition of life upon him, you know, this kind of place of just suffering and futility. And I mean, it's really comic because, you know, this is all we have, you know, that like there's no alternative. But it's also kind of true, you know.
Right.
And it's very Schopenhauerian.
I want to read another Schopenhauer that nails this as well. So he goes, "In our early youth, we sit before the life that lies ahead of us like children sitting before the curtain in a theater, in happy, intense anticipation of whatever is going to appear. Luckily, we do not know what will really appear, for to him who does know, children can sometimes seem like innocent delinquents, sentenced not to death but to life, who have not yet discovered that their punishment will consist of. Nonetheless, everyone desires to achieve old age, that is to say, a condition in which one can say, today it is bad, and day by day it will get worse, until at last the worst of all arrives." There's something that anticipates the Beckett man of the trilogy. I would say that's basically it.
Yeah.
You have to continue on, but it's also going to get incrementally worse at the same time.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't know what to say.
So ending up on this kind of perhaps darker note, it is kind of fascinating reading this. What are we, 60 years? A little over 60 years out from when this was published? Maybe even closer to 70 from when it was written. So what is your feeling for kind of advertising this to the modern reader as something that's still relevant or perhaps of substance?
I mean, the problems are still with us, you know, the problems of living in a world in which, you know, values are really difficult to ascertain, where there are no external structures giving us value in some kind of inarguable way. You know, it's a choice now. Like you choose, say, to believe in God, or you choose to, you know, follow a particular path in life. You know, even still, you know that it's a choice. And I think that Beckett is, this is hard, you know, this question. It's funny. I mean, that would be one of the big selling points.
Yeah, I mean, we are in the sort of postmodern dilemma of once those structures come apart, there isn't a set of rules to tack to.
Yeah.
And this sort of greatly anticipates that. I
mean, another big thing is that about this book is that it's about being a person in a series. You know, what takes up a position in the house. From Arson, his place is taken by Mix after him. Everyone is sort of part of a series. And this is, I think, it's a very apt description of our feeling now where, you know, we're very aware of our generational position, you know, and the generations that'll follow us and what our kind of automatic acceptance of the places that are offered to us. I mean, you know, in sort of very sort of simple terms about Western living, what those mean and whether we can accept them or whether we can reject them. And this kind of the automatic nature of the generations is I think, really coming into question. And so what is, you know, it affects some kind of interruption through showing that seriality, through showing these, like describing these long lists of placeholders. It really raises the question of what is it to be a placeholder? What do we do in that place?
Empirically sort of forces you to think in that manner.
I think so.
And maybe actually that's where some of the purpose comes from. If you've lost the higher purpose, maybe the little steps are where it's at.
Yeah, I mean, the scene at the end of the novel where Watt gets knocked unconscious in the waiting room by the bursar who just hurls the door open too vigorously. And then they decide to wake him. You know, they don't want to just leave him unconscious on the floor, but they throw the bucket of slops over him. It's just so, it's so awful. It's hard. I think it's meant to be funny, but there's also a kind of, it's an ethical scene, you know? Yeah. And these are people who care very little.
There's a horrible truth to it.
Yeah. They're really callous and they're sort of smugly happy with the world. And I think the novel is trying to kind of shake us out of that sort of callousness.
Well, thank you very much for joining and discussing this book that I believe, despite how much we said how dark it is and how meaningless the world is now and how this will help you get through it, it is amazingly funny. and super enjoyable. So I very much appreciate you stopping by and chatting about it.
Thanks so much for having me, Nick. It was really a pleasure.
Vivacious, restless, a popular nudist, regular in my daily health,